Welcome to another weekly insight, this time on leading change, inspiring sustainability initiatives in organizations. We're exploring how leaders can effectively lead change and inspire teams to embrace sustainability initiatives, emphasizing the role of leadership in driving meaningful transformation. So, we get this question from people that are leaders in organizations, want to do sustainability, and they say, I tell people to do it, meaning sustainability, but they don't. What shall I do? Frank, how would you answer that question of a leader?
Well, that's a bit of a shoe-in, isn't it? I mean, telling people what to do typically is not a very good way of going about it. It is, first of all, establishing rapport and engaging and see what is hot and what is not amongst your audience, amongst your organization, and work your way back from there. So I'd say deep listening. Creating the space for a deep conversation, hopefully with reference to the corporate values, and building it from there and see what's happening.
What is deep listening to you, Frank?
There's listening between the lines. Often people feel something or want to do something and articulate it. And sometimes, of course, it's very straightforward, but particularly in this space, how do you achieve a more balanced outcome for your business activity and for your team and for yourself as a leader? It's a bit of a search journey. It's not immediately obvious, and many of the issues or many of the solutions, the issues that we currently grapple with, still need to be conceived. So they ask a question, and then you try to listen between the words, what is actually being asked and what the issue actually is. And then connect back with the individual to see if that indeed is the deeper underlying heart of the matter.
Do you have an example of that?
Do I have an example of that? Well, let me give you one example. So recently I was in a dialogue with leaders about the engagement survey of a company, and the engagement survey gave a lot of positive feedback back to the leaders, but there were also some elements in there that surprised them. And they didn't quite expect that and didn't really know what to do with it. And when assessing the leadership itself, it struck me that in fact the feedback they were getting was the mirror of some of the characteristics of the leadership.
I know you mentioned something before about, when you go particularly into big traditional companies, that things are moving at a real glacial pace, right?
Yeah, that's another example that companies who've been, people who've been working, so this is not perhaps an example of the question you asked earlier about deep listening. But it is true that in many companies that have been around for rather longer, that people have gotten used to a certain way of doing things, a certain corporate rhythm, a corporate culture. And if indeed then fundamental change is on the cards, people oftentimes don't feel they have the power to bring that up or to initiate that. And so they basically comply with or conform with what is the accepted standard and what is the expected rule, and they assume and they don't question. And I wish for those people to actually question how much space there is to actually make the change, and they may discover that there's actually much more room for the change to be made than they think there is. But of course, that depends from company to company. Some companies, for whatever reason, are very stuck in their ways and very difficult to change. It may also depend on the sector they're in. So if you take companies like Shell or other large industrial companies, capital intensive, then quite often it's very difficult to change course because of the capital intensity and the requirement to make a return on the earlier investments.
Yeah, and to build on that, I have worked in Shell myself as well, so I know exactly what you mean. It's a company culture where, people are just simply not trained to stick out their neck and say, hey, come on, let's get moving. Let's do this for real. And I have also worked with smaller companies that are also having difficulties to change. And so you would think, okay, smaller organization, less people, less ingrained processes and vested interested and relationships, all that stuff. You would think they would be more nimble. And what I found is if a smaller company has a difficulty to change and adjust course, it usually is a reflection of the company leader itself, who has then really challenges to adjust his or her modus operandi. So let's say they want to become more sustainable with down the way they use the supply chain. However, if the company leader, for example, is trained to be, opportunistic, jump on the best possibility that comes along and just make this work, then the sustainability question really coalesces with this opportunistic approach, which is, totally fair when you, start building up a company from scratch. I mean, everybody will tell you as an entrepreneur, you need to be opportunistic. However, if you want to start taking into account what is the cost to the environment, what is the cost to the society by being so opportunistic, that's when it starts getting difficult. Laura, what's your take on this?
Yeah, and I think one of the things also touches upon your comment about small companies, because I think as a leader, you have to set the example and live the example, and not from the boardroom throw it out there and say, do sustainability, good luck, next to all your daily activities. But you really have to support the people and also specifically support the people that are enthusiastic about sustainability. Use that energy to get the whole organization going. But if as a leader, you don't give the right example, people are not going to follow.
Yeah, so I love that you bring this, Laura, because there is another conundrum that we have heard from company leaders, and that is, indeed, you can have a kind of energy in the company, a kind of drive, people want to do something, and it can also become kind of activist company. So one conundrum that we have heard is like, I have activists in my company who rock the boat too hard. What shall I do? Frank, how would you tackle that question?
Well, activist energy can be quite helpful in initiating change and raising awareness, mobilizing the corporate community, or putting pressure on institutions or decision makers, activating grassroots initiatives or demonstrations. But I think, let's say, initiating change, so it plays a role in the initiation of the change. But for that to be successful, I believe you also need to be a little bit strategic about it, because at some point you want to flip that to get great collaboration and adoption of what the underlying ideas are. So I think it's very good to have activist energy in the organization to get things moving. But activist energy alone may run the risk of at some point also triggering a countervailing energy and a pushback if you don't at the right moment transform that in constructive energy that builds as opposed to that is activist.
Yeah, and I was really kind of prompted by what you said before about the deep listening, because I feel like particularly in this situation, the deep listening is an important thing to say. So important thing to use, because people on the outset can use sometimes quite angry or confrontational words, right? And then the art is then to listen really deeply underneath what is it that they are really expressing.
Yeah, indeed. I think it's very important that as a leader, if you're at the receiving end of this, to engage respectfully and acknowledge the energy that is there and the issue that is there, and have dialogue for understanding.
Right. So I had an individual, quite interestingly. I mean, usually his way of engaging was more held back. He wouldn't voice too much opinion and stuff. He was just a very good co-worker. However, at one occasion, we went out for dinner and we started talking about the social inequality in the world. And that's when suddenly, you could see him igniting, and he was saying, you know what? It's not us, it's them, and I was like, whoa, where is this coming from? Suddenly there was fire, there was passion, and I was like, oh, I've never seen you so awake. Tell me more. I was really intrigued by him, what was going on, that he came out and he told, how this whole system of money and how, people who have money could keep on accumulating more money and how this is wrong and all these things. And he was really very well read and versed on this topic as well. And there was so much coming up. And some of it was really confrontational and kind of blaming, in your face, right? But I was just so intrigued by his passion, and you could hear that this was something that was really important to him. So over the due course of the time that we were sitting there, because other people were part of this conversation and they were kind of triggered by this confrontational energy, and they would go and say, yeah, you can't do it like this, like this. And I kept on encouraging to share and say, I love what you say, and tell me more about this and stuff. And so in the end, we came to a point where I said, so how about putting this into action at work? How could you take what you shared tonight and say, okay, good, how can we somehow, how can you put this somehow instrumental, not only, for you privately, but bring this into work and maybe bring this even into society and start using this energy. And it was just amazing how much more energized and engaged this person came at work, because he finally got permission to bring this, to bring this pent up frustration that he had building up and using it constructively. So I know that Laura has a really lovely story on this one too, so please share.
Yeah, it reminds me of public projects. So whenever the government or a private company does a project with in the built environment, you have the groups that live there who sometimes are not agreeing with the fact with what is really happening. And my husband did a project, the same thing. He was building a large electric installation in a nature environment. It was not an official reserve, but the group that was living across the water from it really thought about the fact that, why are you making this electrical installation in an environment where birds are hatching and where we walk, etc.
But then it was a nature reserve, even it didn't have the
yeah, it was not a protected environment, right, but it was a nature environment. Small side note, the project was a sustainable project. It was a shore power installation, so the ships that would lay there were able to turn off their engines and stuff, so that was a good cause. But the electrical installation still had to be there. So what they did is they, instead of going against the people that lived there and arguing why it was a really good idea, they hired an architect who was specialized in these kinds of operations. So who would take into account the wishes and the fears of the people that live there, and take that into account in the design, making it more expensive, of course, because it would be easier than, or it would be more difficult than just putting like a box over there. But in the end, the project was not delayed. It went much more fluently, and the image of the company was saved. So that's also the way these people felt listened to for the large part. There were still a few people who were like, no, we don't want it, basically sidelined. But they felt really engaged, acknowledged, and listened to. So that's why it worked.
Beautiful. And it brings another conundrum up that's in there about, like, clearly there were people, as the companies involved there, but also the people living there, they wanted to have this happening fast. However, there were some stumbling blocks. And so it could have become something that is really drawn out and dragged out and could have slowed down this whole progress, which is another one that we have heard leaders ask us, is like, I want the change faster. And I also want to go actually beyond the checklist and external regulations. How do I go about it? So Frank, what's your take on this?
Yeah. I think the important thing is to get to the heart of the matter. We talked about the deep listening earlier, and the same is true about conversations about the subject, that you try to identify what the most effective solution is. And so my experience is jumping at the first idea that springs to mind is perhaps not the best advice. Typically, in my case, it may take a little while, but maybe in second or third instance, then the better solution or the better answer to the question is devised. So make sure that we have the conversation and take the time for that to really explore the various options available, and don't jump on the first thing that springs to mind.
Laura, what's your, with that, not so taking the time to go beyond and stuff, what do you feel is a necessary mechanism in this?
Well, I think it builds on what Frank says, because he says you have to listen deeper to your people, what is underneath that, but people don't know that themselves. So empowering them to develop their personal leadership and encouraging people to take that deep dive into themselves to find out what is really important for them, that will in itself already help. But it will also help review the stories and question the stories that live in the organization. If you have customers who are not willing to change or are not in your sustainable picture, is it really impossible to say no to a customer, for instance? Or is it really impossible to diminish certain activities? So really question the stories that live in the culture of the organization.
Yeah, and then on this, so I love this, how we just like, build up, then the next one and the next one. Once you have nailed it, once you have said, okay, good, this is actually the story that has been preventing us to move faster. Once you've nailed it, I say, just do it. Design an experiment to formulate the hypothesis very clearly. Like, okay, if we do A, B, C, then we will lose customers. Let's do a very small controlled experiment, set it up, execute it, and see what's the outcome to confirm or disconfirm the hypothesis. So just get going with little experiments, and with these experiments, get people involved and get them excited. And that's how you start getting faster change, at least in my view. All right, that was it for today. Any other reflections on the topic that we had chosen about leaders giving space to initiatives? Are there any final things that you feel need to be said to this topic?
I'd say perhaps on the last point, also be very mindful of who it is you have in the team with whom you're going to tackle some of those issues, and strike the right balance between people like me who are slightly more strategic and may first want to get the complete overview and see all the potential angles before kicking into action, and those who have more propensity to action and may get ahead of themselves and then have to be pulled back to. If you get the right balance between that, perhaps that will help you accelerate to the highest possible extent the the most responsive, the best response to the particular situation you're in.
Nice. Laura, from your part?
No, I think the deep listening and getting to know what's really going on, and from that, build on that, and really make an out-of-the-box change. Don't be afraid to stand out of the crowd and do it differently than maybe other people in your industry.
Lovely, thank you. So to summarize, there are 3 key takeaways. Clearly, leadership plays a very critical role in driving meaningful transformations towards sustainability. And the leaders need to inspire and motivate their teams to embrace change by creating space for initiatives and providing the necessary resources. The second one is successful change requires a shift in mindset from obligation and push to attraction and invitation. Leaders should communicate the benefits of sustainability initiatives and make them an integral part of the company's values and cultures, rather than having it a nice to have. And last and not the least, which is the one that we have discussed the most extensively, authentic and servant leadership styles are more effective than authoritative and hierarchical leadership styles when it comes to leading change and inspiring sustainability initiatives. Leaders should lead by example and model their behavior they want to see in their teams, rather than just telling them what to do. Thank you so much for listening today, and see you next week for the next Weekly Insight. Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.